of Edinburgh. And I will turn it over to you, Sotiria, to share your remarks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks everyone for attending today's session. Above all, I need to start by sharing my thanks to Melanie, Will, and all the authors of the special issue for the fantastic collaboration we had. Special thanks go to Will Smith, because if it wasn't for him, yeah, I mean, he contributed so much to the putting together of the special issue. So, yeah, I need to make sure that this is said. Okay. Really, yes, I mean, where can I start? I kind of entered this field of looking at the education and kind of the notion of governing by numbers about 20 years ago, when we were still kind of trying to figure out what is the role of the rise back at the time in the 2000s of the rise of data and numbers for the field of education. My research, to start with, focused more on the European education policy space, but also more broadly, the global policy one. And at the time, we were wondering and working, if you like, with ideas around soft governance. So the role that numbers have in the construction of a unified space of policy convergence. Now, 20 years on, and this is really the primary focus of the special issue, we are in a very different world where the influence of data and numbers in constructing this kind of unified policy space, in offering kind of a common policy direction, is completely taken for granted. From the Millennium Development Goals all the way to the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 4 in particular, it is extraordinary to see not only how, you know, numbers and quantification has completely taken over the field, but in fact things that weren't taken for granted before, like the construction of common policy discourses and narratives, but even really the notion of constructing a third moral space where developing specific goals for education is also considered kind of an ethical and moral process to perform, has completely taken over the field. It is very interesting for my work, for the work of the special issue overall, to examine how the governing by goals, sort of the construction of shared narratives and discourses around education, what education should really be about, the governing by numbers, you know, the specific data and statistics that are to be gathered in order to direct policy in specific ways, but also kind of the moral argument, if you like, that decolonial argument that these spaces should not be solely controlled by the global north any longer, but country participation and country ownership in these processes is absolutely seen as crucial, is really guiding the SDG 4. Of course, as we all know, these spaces are still dominated by massive power asymmetries, and sometimes discourse is not really matched with the reality of these practices. And I suppose this special issue is trying to really grapple with this problem. On the one hand, dealing with a set of goals, the SDG 4, that claims to bring both that kind of technocratic agenda together with democratic sort of participation together, as if it is possible to actually bring them together in a mix. But also, of course, the fact that we know that very often what is required by countries, especially of the global south, in terms of data and goals, doesn't always match their capacity to produce this data, or even really the needs that they have. So this special issue has been an effort, first of all, you know, with the introduction to kind of map the field and examine, if you like, the ways that the field has, in fact, advanced so much over the last 20 years, from kind of looking at numbers as an aid to policy to actually numbers now and goals having become the primary engine for constructing kind of this global education policy field and policy convergence. All the way, of course, to the political work that this takes to put these goals together, and the effects, of course, and very often the unintended consequences that these processes have on on how
and global governance and education.
I think someone has left the mic on. It's okay.
Yeah, please mute yourself.
That is, you're at the right place. That is what we're discussing. Yeah, so the political effects, as I was saying, and the unintended consequences that these practices have in the directions that education is taking. I think the issue has come at a very crucial time when we're more than halfway through the SDG 4, probably already with some people, at the kind of these top tables thinking about what's coming next after SDG 4. So it would be interesting to speculate, if you like, a little bit of that together. But without further ado, I think I've given kind of an introduction. I'll just pass over to Daniel and we can start with the specific papers, which are kind of really going very much more in depth into the actual problems and questions that this whole agenda has risen. I'll stop here and pass over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sotiria. That was wonderful. And so now turning it over to some of the specific papers, we'll have our first panel. Panel 1, we'll start with Professor Elaine Unterhalter from University College London's Institute of Education, who will be talking about her piece on soft power in complicated and complex education systems, gender education, and global governance and organizational responses to SDG 4. So Elaine, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And thanks for the opportunity to give some highlights from my paper in the special issue to this launch discussion. I think the paper is an attempt to look at policy and narratives around gender and education, and that's been a key site for articulation and contestation associated with soft power and some of that moral orientation that Sotiria was referring to. If we go to the next slide, what I'm pulling together on this slide is the idea that from about 1975, and the UN conferences that started to be held at the height of the Cold War, gender and women's rights and forms of education constituted an important terrain of policy, practice, and mobilization. And many contestations were part of this, in which education is seen either as locking women into a particularly hierarchical and competitive form of modernization, which replicates all the divisions of race and class or ethnicity, or education is seen as a key for undoing these structures of power, or it's some uncertain kind of bridge. So, but gender constitutes, and this is Desmond McNeill's term, a moral grammar, that it kind of contributes to international organizations framing discourses. If we go to the next slide, what the paper aims to do is look at this debate and this kind of portrayal of gender and how this is played out in response to the SDGs, and in particular SDG 4. So how the text SDG 4 came to be interpreted or negotiated or contested in international development organizations. And on the next slide, you see again, and the next slide is about the kind of key organizing idea of the paper, which is one that is quite, has been kind of invoked in quite a bit of writing on education systems, this distinction between complicated and complex education systems. So in the complicated system, gender would be defined narrowly as, say, girls or boys, and there would be set relationships to address a problem of children out of school and set relationships. Whereas in complex ideas of education system, gender is highly diffuse, and the relationships and approaches to solving it very complicated, very multifaceted and overlooking. And so what I've tried to do in the paper is try and see whether this binary holds up in looking at education, at the way in which gender and education was looked at in a range of organizations. If we go to the next slide, what it shows you is, I think, the point that Sotiria was making about the SDGs, that in SDG 4, you both have a kind of articulation of a form of complicated organization, in that gender is portrayed as linked with the distribution of targets and gender parity. Gender is a variable associated with enrollment and progression. You can measure it and you can map it, and you can map delivery and accountability for it. But then in SDG 4.7, you have this gesture towards complexity and this kind of open-ended, very difficult to measure target about promoting sustainable development through education, sustainable lifestyles, human relations, gender equality, promoting a culture of peace and nonviolence. So you have in SDG 4 both these kind of orientations to thinking about gender. And then if we go to the next slide, what it summarizes is the strands of examination in the paper and the way in which I carried out the analysis, because the paper is considering how and whether that binary between complicated and complex organizations is present in the policy texts and approaches to practice of international development organizations. And the main methodology was a close reading of policy documents and a kind of reflective discussion with some members of staff in the selected organizations. The next slide explains how I made the selection of the organizations whose documents I looked at. I drew on a kind of conceptual map I'd myself drawn up in a book I wrote in 2008 on gender, schooling, and global social justice, where I distinguished between three kinds of approach to work on gender, what I called interventions, which was a kind of bounded form of intervention around girls' or boys' education. And that's clearly linked with the notion of a complicated organization. What I called institutions and the approach to address gender mainstreaming and grapple with some of the issues of power. And I thought that could touch complicated and elements of complex in organizations. In that 2008 book, I identified interactions, which at that stage was rather loosely formulated by me. But I think now the space of interactions has actually become a major site of activity. So I've divided interactions into two halves: the kind of gender activism, which I see as associated with particular narratives and ideas about youth agency and girls' leadership. And I'm called that an instance of complex. And then this fourth side type, which I've called interactions through feminist mobilization, an attempt to undo unjust structures that perpetuate gender and intersecting inequalities. On the next slide, you can see the three organizations that I studied, because I was so I chose GPE as an example of an organization that I thought was primarily focused on interventions. The Gender at the Center initiative, which has done a lot of work on gender mainstreaming with governments in Africa, I chose as an example of institutions. And I chose the Malala Fund, which is focused a lot on youth leadership and girls' voice as an example of interactions. And I couldn't find a fourth organization to study that was very concerned with gender transformation, although since I wrote the paper, there's been more organization around this network called Femnet for Gender Transformative Education. And one of the questions we might want to consider is whether that is an example of the fourth. If we go to the next slide.
1 minute, Elaine.
Yeah, that's fine. The close reading of their of the documents looks at different elements of power, portrayals of gender, how they understand education systems, and what forms of accountability they use. And the key takeaway, I think, is that the binary of the complicated and complex organizations doesn't hold up, that in each organization there are elements of both. And that SDG 4, although initially a key framing idea for each one of them, for different reasons, they get further and further away from the ideas of SDG 4 and start to articulate different visions of gender. So on the last slide, Daniel, which is just a series of questions, because I think having gone in detail through looking at these documents, they raise more questions than they answer. And I think one of the key questions for me is, how do we analyze soft power in this changing global formation? Do we see it as just a kind of soft version that doesn't challenge the relationships of exploitation, authoritarianism, rampantly destructive forms of political power? Or is soft power a kind of useful frame that allows us to temper some of these worst feelings? And I'm myself unsure. I see it as both useful and something to criticize. So I think we need a lot more work. We need a lot more thinking about the normative frames, how to engage much more with context, not just in the sense of country ownership, but in a sense that's more reflexive of the nature of those contexts. Building global governance links with other feminist organizations and pushing the boundaries of analysis, I also think is an important task that hasn't been much undertaken. And then there remains the issue of engaging with people whose voices are silenced, perspectives that are lost, and aspirations that can keep us going through hard times. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for those reflections on your paper. We'll have time for Q&A after we have 3 papers presented, so please start thinking about your questions. You can even start typing some of them into the chat if you'd like, and if you'd like to raise them in the Q&A vocally, you'll have the opportunity to do so. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So Jhon Jairo Ocampo will be sharing about his paper on transforming education, or transforming the 4th Sustainable Development Goal. Jhon Jairo Ocampo is a permanent delegation of Chile to UNESCO, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for this opportunity. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor William Smith, Melanie Elben, and Sotiria Grek for inviting me to contribute to this special edition. I also extend my congratulations to all the co-authors, and review editors who made possible this edition possible. The structure of my presentation will cover the following points. So I will present an overview of my doctoral research on global governance of SDG 4. Then I will explain a little bit the article who was co-authored with Professor Lira Benitez. I hope she is also online. And the article was divided in 2 parts. The first part analyze the transition from SDG 4 to the Transforming Education Summit. The second part, it critically analyze it inquired the multi-stakeholder governance that it is introduced in the Transforming Education Summit, and we finished with some concluding remarks. So about my research, it is a multi-scale analysis research which deals with global, national, and local formulation and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal 4 of education, and analyze the implementation at the local level of target 4.7 in the cities of São Paulo and Bogotá. So regarding our article, as in the editorial of the special edition, is highlighted how the global governance of SDG 4 could be seen as a product or as a mechanism. The article examines the reform process of the global education cooperation mechanism. In addition, it presents an empirical analysis of the ways in which global governance uses global symmetry to frame education policies. In this context, it will be helpful to clarify key concepts used in the article, as well as its theoretical and methodological framework. So an important concept used in the article is global governance of education. The global governance does not necessarily represent a unified consensual view of the purpose and scope of education. Instead, it manifests multiple processes, actors, visions, and ideas which interact asymmetrically according to their different levels of power and authority. So the theoretical and methodological framework used was political sociology of global education and ethnographic methods of international organizations. So these approaches allow us to analyze the distribution of progress across cycles and contesting dominant forms of knowledge, authority, and discourse in policy making, and how contemporary problem is defined and how mechanisms of power and knowledge production are mobilized in particular forms of defining problems and finding their solutions. So one important element that we analyze in the first part of the article is the introduction of the Global Education Cooperation Mechanism, which was decided in the global education meetings in 2020 and 2021. And we would like to know also that, as far as I know, Professor Karen Mundy, she also helps intellectually to the working group that established this new global education cooperation mechanism. And we observe that it is a shift from more an intergovernmental structure to more a more multi-stakeholder structure. So this is an element that we discuss in the article. And other aspect in the first part of the article is that in the 2020 and 21st global education meetings, it was introduced the benchmark indicators. So, and we observed that there is like two parallel agendas. One is from the SDG 4 targets, another is the benchmark indicators, and another one is the global initiatives that were decided on the test and the Transforming Education Summit. So we are going to discuss a little bit the second part of the article. It's called Test Transforming Education Summit Towards a Multi-Stakeholder Governance. So we observed that the multi-stakeholder governance use global symmetry to define and to redefine some priorities. So some authors have argued that meetings and venues cannot be seen not only through their outcomes or results, but also as a way to legitimize technocratic models and epistemic infrastructures without compromising the political nature of these discussions. Likewise, global symmetry can be viewed as a moment of political theater, performance enactments of legitimacy and authority, and sites for the communication of particular examples of responsible conduct. So, an attempt to define also multi-stakeholder governance. According to Harris Gleckman, multi-stakeholderism has become a new means of global governance characterized by legal lawfulness. On this perspective, multi-stakeholder groups enjoy flexibility in defining themes, selecting members together with the responsibilities and representations, and outlining mechanisms for decision-making and dispute resolution. So we observed that during Transforming Education Summit, there were undertaken some public consultations to legitimize political decisions. We observe in the figures some of the consultations that some meetings made with member states, and also some consultations with civil society. The one that is with the action, one figure shows the consultation for the action track 5 on financing education, and also the consultation among young leaders when they were discussing the Youth Declaration. And also we taught our we observed that to illustrate that these public consultations are are made to legitimize political decisions. We wanted to analyze, we conduct a computational analysis of the open consultations for every action track of tests in order to examine the narratives present in the working documents and how they implicitly contribute to shaping the proposed agenda. So this word computational analysis makes us argue that substantial content on every thematic action track proposed by tests has little change after the public consultations. Despite that the
about
aim
a minute left, Jhon.
Sorry? All right. Despite that the public consultations to demonstrate inclusivity and representativeness, it is evident that the collective interventions lack the potential to significantly alter the outcomes. So we observed the 5 action tracks that was proposed in the Transforming Education Summit. Action track, inclusive, equitable, safe, and healthy schools. Action 2, learning and skills for life, work, and sustainable development. Action 3, teachers, the teaching and the teaching profession. And 4, learning and digital transformation, and financing education. Also, we did actors mapping of the co-conveners of the Transforming Education Summit and the key stakeholders, and we observed that most of the stakeholders are predominantly based on the so-called global north. So we argued that it might exacerbate gaps in knowledge production and capacity to respond to the educational challenge contextually and appropriately. So some conclusions, we observed that this is not is not over. Let's say the global education governance is continuing, is dynamic, and we observe that there has been other meetings like the Summit of the Future, where it was more insist more in the competencies of the 21st century. And at the end of October, we had the Global Education Meeting in Brazil, where it tries to equilibrate a little bit the global governance, proposing more social justice and equity. So this is for my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jhon. Again, if you have questions, start thinking about what those are. You can start typing them into the chat, and you can save them also if you want to ask them verbally at the end of this first panel. So with that, we'll move to our third speaker, Antonia Wulff, who is coordinator at Education International. She'll be speaking about her article on sneaking out the back door, interrogating the role of governments in the global governance of SDG 4. Antonia, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. It's great to be with you all. And it's actually great to speak to this article after Jhon's presentation, because we touch upon very similar features of the current education landscape. So this article was really born out of a realization that in the last couple of years, we've seen quite a lot of development in the global education landscape. We've seen some new initiatives, and we saw something that many would have thought of as an opportunity for strengthened governance. My starting point was one of SDG 4, of course, being part of an agenda with very little accountability. The whole ambitious SDG framework, in many ways, having been enabled by the lack of accountability. So juxtaposing, in a way, ambition and accountability, and a lack of accountability being a precondition for an ambitious agenda in the first place. With the COVID pandemic, I think we saw a change in the global discourse on education, a sudden realization of the seriousness. So up until then, SDG 4 had been pretty similar to other SDGs in terms of the progress or the lack of progress. But with the COVID pandemic and the school closures across the globe, we saw a deepening of the so-called learning crisis. And we also saw a strong demonstration of that link between education and all these other development outcomes. So you very clearly saw the role of education, the role of school communities for health, nutrition, well-being. And suddenly education was talked about much, much more. And there were all these new governance spaces. And this is really what I wanted to look at in this article. Were these new openings a sign of a new approach also from governments? Was there any potential in these new fora, these new initiatives, to actually strengthen governance and the role of governments? My entry point was, of course, governance through goals. As Sotiria also mentioned, Bierman and colleagues identified 4 characteristics of governance through goals that they thought made this governance through goals both new and unique. The first of which, of course, was the inclusive goal setting. So as we all know, the SDGs were negotiated in a very, very inclusive way. The second one being the non-binding nature of these goals, of the agenda as a whole. The third one being the weak institutional arrangements that characterize the SDGs and all of the architecture around them. And then the fourth one, the rather extensive leeway that member states enjoy in terms of how they approach these goals and the extent to which they engage with them, implement them at all. And this, of course, also means that governance through goals can be seen as a response, a reaction to an institutional landscape where rules aren't really easy to agree on, and where kind of a rules-based setup is impossible. And Fukuda Par was talking about how the focus on outcomes, on goals, of course, also allows for a setup where you agree on a common direction, but you don't have to agree on the how, the who, in terms of implementing. So everybody wanted to reach those goals by 2030. That was the common direction that we all somehow agreed with, but then how we would go about realizing these goals was, of course, never agreed, and never had to be agreed with this kind of a framework. I then came across the concept of orchestration and was intrigued as to whether this is a concept that you could apply in the education sector as well. It's a concept that's been born more in the climate space. And I realized that at this moment where we see a failing COP meeting taking place in Baku, it seems very strange to be looking towards the climate space for any kind of good practice on governance. But this is a concept that was born in the analysis of the role of intergovernmental organizations in steering action. And what intrigued me was that this is an indirect form of governance where the orchestrator actually doesn't have the power, the mandate to steer the actions of anyone. So there were many kind of immediate kind of touching points between this and what we see, what we live as we work with the implementation of SDG 4. And what Abbott and colleagues concluded was that member states are often quick to support these intergovernmental organizations taking on this role of orchestrator, because that creates some sort of a governance without in any way creating strong institutions that would have a mandate to force anyone to do anything. And what I then did was try to apply an orchestration lens to some of these new developments that we've seen. So Jhon was talking about the Transforming Education Summit, which took place in 2022, the first ever summit at the level of heads of state on education. And a very good example of the kind of discursive power of the UN system in asserting education as a development priority. The UN Secretary General coming out and very firmly placing education high up on the political agenda. And in doing so, also asserting the need to transform education, not just transform our way of implementing SDG 4, but also really take a look at what our systems look like and to what extent they are fit for purpose in today's world of conflict and crises. And at the same time, it's of course an example of the convening power of the UN system. So that ability to get the right actors around the same table, and by doing that, attempting to steer action. And yet, this Transforming Education Summit is a phenomenal example of a convening that results in very little tangible. And what we've seen in the follow-up to this summit is, of course, that there is absolutely no enforcement mechanism. The second initiative that I wanted to look at is a governance mechanism in itself. Jhon talked about that as well. The updated or reformed global cooperation mechanism, that is the global governance structure for SDG 4, a UNESCO-led process that resulted in a new high-level steering committee for SDG 4 with higher level member state representation, but also, of course, all of those other stakeholders too. So absolutely an example of a multi-stakeholder approach to the governance of SDG 4. And here again, we see quite a remarkable lack of power to start or enforce or stop anything. So formally speaking, this high-level steering committee is the body that is charged with overseeing all of the follow-up from this Transforming Education Summit. Yet this body doesn't have a mandate to really interfere with any of these initiatives, but really can only take note of what all these other actors have decided to do. And
1 minute, Antonia.
That's great. I am wrapping up. And what's so interesting here is that, of course, this multiplicity of actors complicates things quite a bit. And what we've seen is that orchestration is also, in some ways, as a governance form, it often leads to new initiatives, because when you can't control what's going on, you can always launch your own new thing as an attempt to steer something and actually get some action, some implementation going. And at the same time, there remains that lack of anyone with a mandate to actually shape the implementation, nobody with the mandate to quality assure what's going on, and to look at those gender initiatives, for instance, that Elaine talked about, the extent to which these initiatives would be in line with SDG 4, the extent to which their financing arrangements would be supporting the overall ambitions of SDG 4. And then lastly, what I also do look at in this article is the famous benchmarks. This is a UNESCO Institute of Statistics and Global Education Monitoring Report initiative to get member states to themselves commit to benchmarks for a handful SDG 4 indicators. So that means that we've seen a majority of member states now commit to achieving benchmarks for both 2025 and 2030. However, with less than 10 indicators, these benchmarks are, of course, in themselves quite a dramatic narrowing of the SDG 4 scope and what we initially set out to do. So even if we've seen some progress there in terms of member states actually making more tangible commitments than through these other mechanisms, there's a very narrow approach, and it only gets us so far. Thanks so much. I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Antonia. So I've had a lot of really interesting discussions, and I hope that some of you have questions to share. I think there's some interesting reflections there about kind of the difference between a complicated and complex system in terms of framing of gender and how different organizations engage with gender in different ways, and maybe the inclusion of newer organizations that are more transformative. Discussions about how the Transforming Education Summit discourse has been dominated by certain actors, specifically those in the international system and in the global north. And of course, these questions around whether the degree to which the SDG 4 is kind of deliberately complicated in order to make it hard to enforce, and whether some of these systems are meant to have sort of governance without government, without any sort of enforceability, and the broader framing of governance through numbers, and whether those numbers and goals are appropriate and fit to purpose to the different contexts, as Sotiria shared in our opening discussion remarks. So any questions that you have for our wonderful speakers in this first panel, please populate them into the chat, or also feel free to raise your hand in Teams. and we'll go in the order of those hands are raised. Please, when you share your question, please introduce yourself briefly, and then you can move on to your question or comment. Excuse me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Minara.
Yes, please.
I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow. Actually, I read the article, The Sustainable Development Goals as a Product and Mechanism, and I'd like to thank all the authors for their incredible insights. And I especially want to thank Professor Melanie Ehren. Actually, for my research, I have been particularly valuable for my research on school inspections and leadership. I read a lot of articles by Professor Ehren. I would to thank her, because this is the first time I see her. And my question, the authors mentioned about utilitarian and kind of approaches to education. It was about the humanistic approach and utilitarian approach to education in the article. I'd like to ask how we can reconcile these approaches to education without compromising their efficiency. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Melanie, are you there with us to address that question?
I am, but I'm not sure if it's for me. I mean, I can say something about kind of the paradigm between efficiency and effectiveness. I'm not sure if they're distinct approaches. Depends on what you mean by efficiency, I guess. I mean, if we think about effectiveness in terms of school inspections, it would be trying to raise quality of schooling across the system. And efficiency, to me, really talks about how you do that in the most efficient way, and in a way that doesn't really narrow teaching and learning in schools. I often kind of work with school inspection agencies to look at how you can assess and evaluate quality in a broader sense, also kind of supporting professionalism in the school of teachers, of school leaders, the way they evaluate their own school. So to me, kind of a professional approach to school inspections would allow for both kind of combining the idea of raising school quality, but also doing that. I don't know if efficient is the best word for it, but trying to do that in a way that raises quality across the board. I hope that at least touches on some of the question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your question. Please feel free to chime in with other questions. Raise your hand so we know who needs to ask a question, and feel free also to populate any sort of questions in the chat. And in the spirit of kind of collegial dialogue, those of you on the panel can feel free to also ask each other questions as well.
Well, in the meantime, I would like to address the question, because in our article, we also mentioned this distinction between a humanistic approach and a utilitarian approach, our instrumental approach, and we observed that sometimes when we mix those concepts, sometimes it is made in a intergovernmental organization like UNESCO. They try to mix these concepts to arrange different actors. So you can see some states that can work with some humanitarian, holistic vision of education, and others they can have more instrumental vision. and that's why there is not like a judge of which of those are better. It's more that you have these different options as a state at the state level, and but sometimes if we mix them, probably there will be some that will be first than others. So you can have more humanistic vision or utilitarian vision, but sometimes it's not possible to make it both. I mean, it's like to be neutral or to is you just sometimes you don't do much.
Thank you, Jhon, for those remarks. I also see Shoko Yamada's hand is up. Feel free to chime in, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very nice, interesting, insightful presentation from the three presenters. I'd like to ask Jhon and Alexa about the factors which change the gravity of the discourse. I think I assume that both of you are talking about the kind of transformation of the ideas in the course of discourse. And do you notice any kind of factors which change the gravity of the discussions? For example, the personality of the people who represent the organizations, or probably those the ideology where must be the kind of the surface of the key ideas to be promoted. Rather, the ideas must be the representation of some kind of contextual factors, personality, organizational characteristic, or those kinds of things. So if you can give us some insights about the real nature of the politics of interactions, that would be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shoko Yamada. So Jhon and Antonia, I don't know which one of you wants to answer that first.
Do you want to go ahead, Jhon?
You can start, Antonia.
Both of us, so polite. I'm not sure I fully understood your question, to be honest. So I'll make an attempt to answer what I think you asked. And I'm going to do it as someone who spends quite a lot of my time sitting in these meeting rooms, looking in fascination at the fact that despite member states being so keen on underlining their role as being in the driving seat, and this is a member state-led agenda, and they are in charge, they are in fact remarkably passive in many of the conversations, many of the debates, many of the decisions that are being made. And the loudest ones in the room are different international organizations, with UNESCO, OECD, the World Bank, the Global Partnership for Education being very visible, and then different civil society actors. So within the global SDG 4 coordination, you have a civil society representative, you have the teachers, where I sit myself. So full disclosure, they're biased in that sense. And then you have private sector and philanthropy. They share a seat. They are not as loud as many of us would think, and as you'd think also when you read some of the kind of critical analyses of this multi-stakeholder kind of governance in the education space. Jhon was talking about the global north and organizations headquartered in the global north being the loudest. I definitely share that view. And generally, organizations that have the financial resources to propose things, to take initiatives, but also financial resources to read documents, do all of that preparatory work to be able to engage in processes that actually are hugely time consuming. I don't know, Jhon, does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you. I think it is an opportunity to reflect on the nature of multi-stakeholderism and intergovernmental discussions. So I agree that sometimes at the state level it's difficult to handle the different discussions that we in the permanent at the state level they have to deal with an organization like UNESCO. So let's say there are not many specialists on education at the permanent delegations, and because they are diplomats, professional diplomats, so they are more generalist, and they need to have some feedbacks from the capitals, which are the specialists, but not necessarily they are specialists of international discussions or global governance. They are more they have more knowledge about the national context. So our role in the permanent delegation is maybe to close this gap, but sometimes we are overwhelmed of different tasks. So it is by chance that I am doing my research and working in the same topic that I can try to move forward and bring some more qualitative contributions to our work in the permanent delegation of Chile. And also I wanted to mention about the multi-stakeholderism. I think when we bring this approach, there is less democratic decision making, because these organizations normally they are accountable to their own members instead of member states that are accountable to their citizens. So let's say we observe that it's important to have an inclusion of different actors. The problem when we have the inclusion of different actors is that there are some more powerful than others, and they have more resources and they can bring more inputs to the agenda. I wanted to mention some interesting actor is the global campaign for education is the actor for civil society, and as well as the international education, and I think they work a lot for the agenda because they bring some civil society insights, they bring some and they work, they do research, and so they can contribute more in those discussions. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jhon. Apologies for my voice. I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old who like sharing their bugs with me. So, so we have a question in the chat from Eugene Zhang, who's a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. I have a question for Jhon. The description of multi-stakeholder governance as creating loopholes for governments in their initiatives is very intriguing. In the context of the internationalization of higher education, I find the actions of these multi-stakeholders comparable to those of private for-profit organizations. If that's the case, should we consider these stakeholders operating at the national level as resembling private for-profit entities rather than public authorities? This perspective seems relevant, especially given the challenges in clearly defining responsibility or authority in the context of global symmetry. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Jhon, and if others have any questions, they can pop them in the chat. We're going to transition after this question to the other portion of our session. But if you have questions in the chat, I'm sure that our speakers would be happy to respond to them in the chat as well. But Jhon, over to you.
Well, yes, I think it is also related with what I was talking before. Yes, at the national level, there are some aspects where multi-stakeholderism is entering to dispute the public policies decisions. Let's say there is a outsourcing of private consultants to make some public policy proposals, and sometimes this is more like the neoliberal aspect of the state. So now it is not the state that take the public decisions, but there are multiple actors, and some actors, they can influence the decisions. So this is something that is part of how it's happening at the global level and also at the national level.
Thank you, Jhon. Oh, thank you, everyone, for that first panel. I really appreciate your insights. We're now going to move on to our second panel of articles from the special issue. And so we'll turn over first to William Smith. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. And as you see there, he has multiple co-authors who worked with him on the article Prioritizing of Indicators in SDG 4, Voluntary National Reviews as a Tool of Soft Governance. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Will.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel. First, it's great to see this issue coming out. So really excited to have all the authors and editors in the room joining us. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for this virtual launch. I want to thank all of my co-authors. These are actually 5 students that were working with me during their Master's in Comparative Education and International Development. So I had a really good time working with them, learning together about voluntary national reviews. So if you're not familiar with voluntary national reviews, they're part of the larger follow-up and review process. So you've heard already Antonia talk about how the SDGs have a very weak accountability structure. So they do, and I'm going to talk about voluntary national reviews as basically the mechanisms that's there to hold countries to account. We'll talk about whether or not that's an effective tool of soft governance. We've already talked a little bit about some of the framings around this. So I do think about this through governance through goals, governance through numbers, and governance through morality. But you can also think about voluntary national reviews as part of a peer review process. So if you're not familiar with voluntary national reviews, and the SDGs very briefly, so SDG has a high-level political forum. This is an annual meeting where the idea is that this is the space for government officials to share progress. And it's the global structure responsible for assessing progress. At these high-level political forums are voluntary national reviews. And again, the idea is this is country-led, country-driven reviews that are shared there and are, according to the UN, the cornerstone for this follow-up and review process. It is entirely voluntary, which makes it a weak accountability. And the idea is that during this sharing of voluntary national reviews, there'll be peer review and peer learning taking place. So you can think about this as a peer review process. There's questions on whether or not any actual review happens, or if it's just basic reporting and there's no critical reflection on it in these high-level political forums. So for this study, I do look at voluntary national reviews, so this report that is shared at the high-level political forum as a potential soft governance tool. So if you haven't looked at voluntary national reviews, they're an interesting bit of evidence base. There's few studies that have actually looked at voluntary national reviews, and fewer that have looked at it considering global governance. So a couple of examples there. I think I'm one of the very, very few who've actually focused on the SDG for education and looking at voluntary national reviews. So at the high-level political forum, every 3 to 4 years, the SDG for education is being reviewed explicitly along with others and SDG 17. So they all rotate. So I did a first review of voluntary national reviews at the first time SDG 4 for education took place, which was 2019. And this is effectively a follow-up on that, but looking at it through a soft governance lens. So the aim here was to examine whether the potential pressure exerted through this peer review process, which is voluntary, but in peer reviews, you are sharing your progress, but also sharing your challenges. So there's oftentimes a risk of reputational damage or naming and shaming going on as part of this peer review process. So I wanted to examine if their pressure exerted has actually influenced who wants to participate, how countries have prioritized indicators in SDG 4, and how selective reporting might be reflecting this type of larger governance by goal setting, numbers, and morality. So I looked at 2 research questions with the rest of my team. So looking at which countries have submitted voluntary national reviews and which education indicators are present in voluntary national reviews. For the first question, we looked basically at just submission patterns across the entire first 7 years of reporting. So up to 2022. So all countries that have submitted. And in the second pattern, we looked at the SDG 4 specific years after going through a series of inclusion criteria, which was 2019 and 2022. So I wanted to, since we've got a lot of good conceptual conversations already, I just wanted to jump to the empirical findings. So first, this is just a very basic breakdown of, in the first 7 years, which countries have submitted voluntary national reviews. And it's interesting to think about, well, why have they done this? If there is a risk to their reputation, if they're not doing well, and we know that most countries aren't progressing well here, and it's entirely voluntary. So 96% of countries at this point have submitted at least one voluntary national review. We can see that Uruguay and Togo have already submitted 4. And when you break down and look at the numbers that have not submitted one, and there were 8 countries, I think, that have not submitted a single review, you get countries that are basically averse of any type of international structure or accountability, regardless of how soft it is. So that includes Iran and the United States as our bigger countries. And then you have a series of fragile countries like South Sudan or Haiti that haven't submitted, and you have some very, very small states as well. So that tends to be the patterns for who hasn't submitted, but nearly universal participation at this point. The second thing I wanted to do was look at, so this is a linear and logistic regression. So a linear regression on the left, which is just looking at how often countries are participating. Are there patterns we can look at? And on the right, it's about have they submitted during an education emphasized year. So on the left, we can see that countries that scored higher up in political globalization, so they were already more engaged globally, are more likely to submit additional voluntary national reviews. We also saw that compared to countries in Europe and North America, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa were more likely to submit additional voluntary national reviews. On the right side, we're trying to look at are countries avoiding basically submitting during education-focused years if they're maybe at risk of reputational damage. So that was the main reason we ran the analysis on the right. We found not much significance on education-focused years, but one of the interesting things is at the very bottom, which is this harmonized learning outcome. Now, I know there's lots of critiques about how the World Bank creates harmonized learning outcome, including from myself, but I need something to look across all of our countries here. So what this shows is that, which was kind of surprising, instead of individual countries avoiding reporting if they were doing poorly in learning outcomes, they're actually more likely to report if they were doing poorly in learning outcomes. So different than what we expected. The second bit was just looking at which education indicators are presented. The SDGs initially, I think we've kind of gone away from this some, was thought to have 4 different types of indicators. And so we basically coded along all 4 of these types. So, and what we found is that basically regional indicators aren't talked about at all in voluntary national reviews. Out of the 28 for 2022, that we looked at, 7 of them had no national indicators presented. And as we'll see in the next slide, the global indicators dominate. And even across the 2 periods, there's a large handful of thematic indicators that are never talked about at all. That includes most of 4/7, unfortunately. So this is just the number of countries reporting out of the 28. For the different indicators, the black indicators are the global indicators, and the blue are the thematic. Right? We can see, generally speaking, global indicators dominate. Despite involuntary national reviews, the United Nations encouraging countries to share about their context-specific indicators, share national indicators, share those that are priorities for them. We still generally see global indicators dominate around this. That's a pattern that's similar in 2019, but getting worse. So instead of seeing more diversity, we're actually seeing less diversity 3 years later. And what type of indicators are being presented? All right, so some final bits for me. If I think about this into the framework of soft governance, we can see that the soft governance approach of governance by goals may have helped motivate nearly universal participation, partially because countries can choose when to participate and how to participate. So they can choose what to report and opt out of any sensitive topics. And that's part of what we might be seeing across voluntary national reviews. As I mentioned before, there's really not evidence in this that past performance in education is related to submission patterns. Instead, I think our results align better with Bexell and Johnson and Elgin, Kosert, and Chandaron research, which suggest that maybe poor performing individuals are participating to boost their reputation or to raise and elevate the status of the country and improve their self-image. And again, not all indicators are equally valued and reported, so this flexibility allows prioritizing some indicators over other. We might think that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think there is a strength in numbers here, because what we see is the global indicators are the ones that are included in global reporting. They're the ones that are encouraged by external funders. There's definitely a drive towards a certain type of indicator and certain values. So there's prioritization of global indicators there. And I think that's it. So yeah, so thanks so much, everybody. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Well, sorry to interrupt you on your last sentence. Thank you very much for that presentation. We'll now turn to our second panelist for this panel, Professor Shoko Yamada from Nagayo University, the Graduate School of International Development. Over to you.
Thank you very much for introduction. The paper included in the special issue from me is to analyze the changing connotation of key themes in the SDG 4. My study is composed of 2 parts mainly. One part is about the discourse analysis toward the formation of SDG 4. I started the study from the end of 2013 and then finished in September 2015. And then I also did the second part of the study is mostly focused on the quantitative analysis of the text posted on the web. And that analysis is about the period after 2015. Well, would you go to the slide 6? I will skip some slides. Yes, so would you go back one slide back? Would you go back more? Yes. So, yes. So the discourse analysis I did is focusing on the words people use in the course of this discussion, exchanging ideas. And then, so do you go to the next slide? The reason why I focus on the word usage is that the word is a kind of like converging point of the exchanging ideas, interactions. People, particularly at the time of agenda formation like SDG, people likes to promote their ideas in relation to the buzzwords such as sustainability or SDG or post-MDGs. So I tried to analyze the connotation people attached to those popular buzzwords. So I'm not going to spend too much time on my analysis of the time when the SDG was formed. I have analyzed the structure of discourse, actors involved in the discourse, circumstances, and the final contents of SDGs, which are related to the motivations and the background of actors involved in the discourse. Would you please jump to the slide which has a diagram? Not this one, next one. This one explains the structure of the discourse. Yes, this one. This one explains the relationship between the types of organizations involved in the discourse and the contents, educational contents they promoted to be reflected to the SDG 4. Would you go to the next, please? Where? Would you go to the next? Yes, so I'm not going to explain the details of all the issues raised in the SDG 4 discourse, but there is one characteristic I'd like to highlight, which is very different from the earlier period, like when MDG was formed or Education for All was formulated. It is a focus on the individual learning outcomes and knowledge and skills. So in the area discussion, even though some passing references were made to the importance of learning outcomes, still the majority of the discussions were focused on the quality and quantity of services, education services, and also the equity in the access. But now, one of the main characteristics I identified in the discourse analysis for SDG 4 formation was a focus on the individual learning outcomes. Either it is cognitive ones like literacy and numeracy, or some behavioral things, non-cognitive behavior, to live in the sustainable world and democratic society. And also it includes the vocational skills and practical skills. Would you go to the next, please? Where? Would you go to the next? Next one, Steve. Would you go to the next? Yes, and another characteristic of the SDG 4 discourse was that I identified some key issues which are discussed mostly at the global level. So the discussions largely focused on the global framework of monitoring and evaluation of the performance of respective UN member countries. And it was mostly normative and abstract without much substance and connection to the realities on the ground. At that time, it was mostly the air fights among advocacy specialists and international education experts. But the agenda was adopted, and then the time comes for the implementation to happen for a long period. So then how did the concepts change over time? That's the question which I pursued with the quantitative text analysis. Would you go to the next? So what I did was a large-scale text analysis to see the diachronic trend after 2015. I downloaded PDF from the web with a search keyword of sustainability, education, and SDG 4. And the download was conducted separately by years. So I downloaded for year 2015, 16, up to 2022. And the total number of the documents used for analysis were 832. And the methodologies I used for analysis is something called topic modeling, statistical topic modeling. So the unit of analysis are words. So the analysis is made between the words relationship. So for example, there might be some popular words which appear very frequently in the documents. then people tend to link other words when they try to explain those popular words. That's the connotation they want to attach to those words. Then the co-occurrence of words indicate what kind of connotation people wants to add to those popular words. And also the distance of words which co-occur also indicates some close relationship or this rather a distant relationship between two words. So co-occurrence, the interword distance and frequency, these are the statistical information which I have analyzed. Would you go to the next slide? So, so this is the result of the word clustering. Quantitatively, I came up with the clusters of words. So the topics listed on the left side of the table indicate how these words came close to each other. So one topic is knowledge, skills, and learning outcomes. Second is global and local critical thinking, social and environmental, students and teachers, local community, COVID and pandemic, and research for sustainability. These are the topics I identified. And as you can see, many of these words are about local issues and individual learners' learning outcomes, and critical thinking is also the matter of skills and knowledge, and also the students-teacher interactions, that is also at the micro level issues, and local community, and COVID and pandemic are also discussed at the school level, the countermeasure to cope with the COVID pandemic. Would you go to the next, please? Yes. So this is a correspondence plot between the year of publication and the topic identified through the cluster analysis. So you can see in this graph that toward the end of the graph, you can see the period close to the adaptation of the SDG. And toward the right end, you can see more recent years. So the topics which appeared toward the left side are the ones which are popularly discussed at the time, right after the SDG 4 adoption. Meanwhile, those ones appear on the right end are more recent topics. So if you look at those ones on the left side, you can see more global topics such as targets and indicators, okay, global governance and policy and strategy. But on the right side, you can see more personal and local issues. Would you go to the next? So to sum up what I have found, sustainability concepts are localizing and linked with the students and teachers' daily concerns as time goes. Working definition of sustainability became diverse and different from society to society. And then the concerns expressed in relation to the sustainability in those documents are how to teach those skills and critical thinking and skills to live in the sustainability world. So in relation to the local realities and still linking the local issues with the global world. So there is no confirmed guidebook for teaching that kind of things. So that's why the ideas are floating, and at the same time, teachers and people acting on the ground are looking for some kind of guidance and solution. Would you go to the next slide? This is the last slide. So, and at the same time, there are the influence of COVID was significant in the text analysis also. You could see that there is a penetration of technology together with the COVID pandemic. COVID made the reliance on educational technologies unavoidable. and emergent measures were taken not to stop education. And this became the momentum for education to become more personalized and to happen in the school education also, not only outside of the school. And there are many technology-related issues started to be discussed in the recent few years. Something about the generative AIs and internet also. So then, in a nutshell, the role of teachers and schools are contested as time goes, and then the discussion becomes more diversified and localized. That's the kind of findings I got from the text analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shoko, very much. Our third panelist, Teklu Bekele, sends his apologies due to family emergency. So we'll now move to discussant remarks from Professor Karen Mundy. So I hope you're with us.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you, everybody. I mean, really quite a pleasure to see a dedicated volume on the SDGs at this moment, right? There was one last year, one this year. I think the more we can read about how this set of global mechanisms is changing, how it is evolving in the context of a very rapidly changing world order, the better off we'll be as a community thinking about the future of education. So I wanted to start, I mean, most of the things I'm going to say are puzzles to me. And so questions to you. They're not really comments on your papers per se, but I will try to come back with a few comments on each of the authors' papers. So just generally speaking, I like to think about global governance of education as sitting within the context of theories about world order, about geopolitics, and about changes in things like demographics and technology and the way in which the world of work is changing. So one of the things I think that is highlighted for me in this group of papers is what you've got is an ever complexifying set of mechanisms, actors who are they held together by global goals, or do they use the global goals for their own purposes? And there's actually quite a bit of tension in what the different authors present. And I think it's worth thinking about. But what this group of papers does not do, and actually I think what we're not seeing as much in the body of knowledge about global governance right now, is efforts to think about how it is that this world order or global context is shaping global governance itself. So not how does global governance shape itself through all of these multifaceted stakeholders, but how is global order going to shape global governance? Of course, after the US election, we are all thinking about this. And so really a challenge to all the authors here to kind of start to think about that. And also maybe you have some immediate ideas. So for me, what I wonder very much in thinking about, especially the use of soft power, such an important concept. But how useful is the term soft power outside of an understanding of the global order and within which soft power is operating? An example, if soft power is being utilized in a context where there is a common agenda for what good governance looks like, or what good education looks like, then that soft power may be more of a consensual kind. You're trying to build consensus. But what if soft power is being used to build geopolitical blocks? I think we can expect that we're seeing a world of isolationism, more regionalism, and a greater effort to disentangle some of our global commitments. So will soft power be different in education in that kind of context? So just an example of a question. One thing that I'm starting to hear in the political science field is a lot of discussion about the end of neoliberalism, but with an emphasis not on the end of neoliberalism, but the end of liberalism. So again, does this change the way multilateral organizations have to work in the field of education? How will it change? what we know for sure is that there's going to be less money for global governance in the next 5 years. No question about that. We know that there's going to be more emphasis on self-interest because we're looking at more of a billiard ball table rather than the US playing an anchoring role in multilateral governance. And we are at the same time seeing quite a change in the space in which education itself works, right? It's just indisputable that you've got AI, new technology, demographic divides that are just kind of unbelievable. I'm about to go to the Transforming Education Summit in South Korea with UNESCO. And in South Korea has the most highly aging population on Earth. If we think about education in the context of South Korea, we have to think about how do adults learn, not just how children learn. And then you turn to the continent of Africa with still not, in many parts, not having reached the peak of demographic growth, the youth population so huge. So just really contrasting parts of the world, so contrasting that sometimes I wonder how these multilateral goals and multilateral mechanisms will ever be able to span the different educational challenges facing these different contexts. So another question is really for our field, I think more, how do we understand the impact of multilateralism at the global level and regionalism and country-based effects or engagement in these different layers? And some of the papers gave us some clues to what might be going on. I think it's, in my impression, is that, as Sotiria mentioned, that governing by goals is very important at the country level, but that there's a deep divide between the goal governing and the numbers governing at national level. We just did a piece of work for ADEA, which we were looking at sort of what are the needs of system level capacity in African countries in education. In the country studies, what policymakers tell us was they need to know how to govern by numbers. We need everybody all the way down from the central to know how to use data. But why? What other ways of governing are there? So I think that question of governing by goals, governing by numbers is very rich and worth rethinking. Will, talking about the fact that the global goals are the ones used in the national reports, I'm not too surprised about that because these voluntary reports are targeted to a national agenda. But I thought that was still a very interesting finding. I want to highlight the methodological advances. So from Shoko, from Jhon, these are very interesting uses of computational methodology, new ways of developing large quantitative data sets of discursive documents. I find it very fascinating. I know Helen Setzer in Bremen is also doing work in this area. Very, very, very exciting. But I wonder myself whether we start to go too inward and not outward enough in those analyses. So is there a way that we can link up those kinds of discursive, large-scale discursive things by comparing what's going on in education to other sectors, or linking discursive changes to broad geopolitical changes, and so on and so forth? Then I wanted to talk just a little bit about Elaine's. I'm hesitating here because it's a really tricky thing to talk about. So one question I have specifically for Elaine, I mean, I really very much appreciate your trying to elucidate the different kinds of interventions in such a complicated environment with all of these different actors using different intervention types. The heterogeneity is actually becoming ever more complicated. That's what you show through your diagram, which is that, you've got at least 5, maybe there's more than that, ways of working on gender alone, and maybe in other subdomains you'd see different kinds of mechanisms. But I wondered very much 2 things. First of all, do those mechanisms have different meaning or play out differently in different sort of periods? Like, would they work the same now as they would have when we had a broader consensus about what educational futures should look like, maybe around 2015 or 2016? I also wondered, so two issues in the gender space. How are these organizations going to handle the issue of the non-binary nature of human existence? I so remember having this debate with the head of UNGAI and her saying, well, like, I'm a feminist. We need binary governance by numbers because that's the foundation for feminism, my feminism, and our, so very curious about that. But also, you know, maybe it's just because of the way the US election played out, or because I'm the mother of 3 adult boys now, young men. The gender discussion, somehow, I feel like in education, we've lost boys from the discussion, and their behaviors are turning out to surprise us a lot, especially those of us who lean towards more social liberalism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Jhon, I mean, so I'm sure I've met you in my time at UNESCO or seen you there, but from the country level, from the country view, from Chile's view, I'd just love to hear a bit more from you about how the global goals are used at the country level. So I'm not so worried anymore about this complex nonsense that goes on up here, where all the organizations are seeking shiny silver balls. They're all out to get more money and more attention. But I am super curious about the way ministers and ministries utilize, in a kind of, they kind of pull down the assets from the global level to shape national politics, or pull down the global level to shape regional politics. I think that's fascinating. Antonio,
maybe about 1 more minute. Excuse me, Karen.
Okay.
I know
Antonio.
We're over. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. And if you need to run, the YouTube recording will be available.
Okay. Antonio, just for you, this notion of orchestration and then what happens in a changing geopolitical context, you sound pretty fed up with the orchestration more generally, but is there something happening regionally or at the country level? And I think I have covered everybody I've mentioned. Yes, good. So that's all I have to ask and say.
Thank you very much.
I was invited to a cocktail party and then told I can say 8 minutes to everybody, and I'd just love to have a cocktail with each of you. So
yeah, we should have a kind of online coffee cocktail bar to have these discussions for a longer period. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here, for sharing, for putting together the special issue, for sharing your questions, thoughts, discussant remarks. It's been wonderful, and I hope that the conversations continue and it's a starting point for continued engagement. And if there's questions, I'm sure that everyone would be happy to receive those questions over email. Please do access the special issue. Look out for future events with the CEID community. And thank you all, and thanks to the editors. And with that, I will say good afternoon and good Friday, and enjoy your weekend when it comes.
And thanks to you, Daniel, for sharing so well.
You're welcome. Sorry we went over, but this is the nature of things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just so much good stuff to go through.